The biggest problem for Cuba, of course, is that they were so dependent on Venezuelan oil. About 25% of all the oil Cuba uses was coming from Venezuela at little or no price in exchange for Cuban doctors serving the poor in Venezuela. Now, the Trump administration has said that that's coming to an end, and the Cubans are going to have to really struggle to find a way to make up that shortfall.
Let's talk about Cuba then, because it's back in the news. It's the old adversary of the United States, and it's been feeling the sting of the Trump administration action post-Venezuela. The capture of former President Maduro 2 weeks ago has meant the regular supply of Venezuelan oil to Cuba has dried up. Cubans have also been mourning the deaths of 32 bodyguards killed in that US operation. And today, tens of thousands gathered in front of the US Embassy in Havana to protest their deaths. So how do we assess Cuba right now? Let's speak to William LeoGrande, a professor of government and a specialist in Latin American politics at the American University in Washington, D.C. William, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Trump put pressure on Venezuela and brought their leadership to heel in the most humiliating way. How critical then is this a moment for Cuba? Because you can imagine that the leadership's mind must have been pretty concentrated by what they've just seen.
Well, yes. I mean, the biggest problem for Cuba, of course, is that they were so dependent on Venezuelan oil. About 25% of all the oil Cuba uses was coming from Venezuela at little or no price in exchange for Cuban doctors serving the poor in Venezuela. Now, the Trump administration has said that that's coming to an end, and the Cubans are going to have to really struggle to find a way to make up that shortfall. They're already facing serious electrical blackouts, shortages of lots of things because they don't have enough foreign exchange currency to meet their needs. And now that situation is going to get worse. The blackouts are going to get longer, and the shortages are going to get worse.
Well, when the US captured President Maduro, the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, condemned Trump, and he says these actions are state terrorism. But I suspect he might have shifted his position in the intervening 2 weeks. What do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think the Cuban protests before the United States Embassy today are evidence that the Cubans are really responding in a defiant way.
Well, that's the people, but what about the leadership? Because they're the ones who will be targeted by Trump if he decides, well, okay, I want these guys out.
Well, no, the leadership organized that demonstration, have no doubt.
Sure.
And, targeting the Cuban leadership Cuba's not Venezuela. Cuba is not at all dependent on the leadership of a single individual. It's a communist political system with all the institutional structure that is typical of that kind of a system. You could snatch the Cuban president tomorrow, and the political bureau of the Communist Party would just elect his successor.
Right. And what about the role of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has, of course, got a Cuban heritage? And he announced a couple of days ago that the US is, after about 77 days delay, going to send the first humanitarian shipment to the island to help people recovering from Hurricane Melissa.
Well, this is so ironic. We're going to send several $1 million in humanitarian assistance, which is a good thing in itself, but we're doing it at a time when we're cutting off Cuba's oil supply, which will have a much bigger impact on the standard of living of ordinary Cubans than $3 or $4 million worth of emergency assistance. So it's really kind of cynical, frankly, for us to be bragging about the help that we're giving to the Cuban people at this point. Marco Rubio made his political career as the most vociferous anti-Cuba legislator in the United States Congress. He, I have no doubt, is interested in overthrowing the Cuban government. I think he believes that cutting off oil from Venezuela is the way to do that. I think he's mistaken. I think it's just going to create more misery for the Cuban people without actually having much impact in terms of the basic structure of the Cuban political regime.
Just looking at the latest statements of President Miguel Diaz-Canel saying, Cuba, we're a free, independent and sovereign nation. No one dictates what we do. We don't aggress. We're aggressed upon by the United States for 66 years. I'm paraphrasing here. But Trump, as you know, has said this week, Cuba, strike a deal with the US before it's too late. There'll be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. I'm just wondering what kind of deal Trump has in mind with Cuba.
I don't know. I think everyone would like to know. This is the first word that we've heard of Trump's willingness to engage with the Cubans to see if there's some kind of an agreement that could be reached. In fact, we, the United States, have had no substantive diplomatic exchanges with the Cuban government whatsoever since Donald Trump came to office last January. So if there's a deal to be had, I'm sure the Cubans would be interested in hearing what he thinks the terms are. Cuba has always been willing to sit down with the United States and talk. Their only limitation is they're not willing to negotiate their sovereignty or the nature of their political system or the nature of their economic system. Now, of course, that takes off the table some of the main things that the United States has wanted to change in Cuba for the last 66 years, which is why we haven't been able to reach an agreement, except for that brief 2-year period at the tail end of President Barack Obama's administration.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to Cuba's system, people who defend Cuba say, well, you can't compare it to Venezuela. You can't denounce what the Castros and now the current president have achieved in the way that you might Chavez and Maduro, who are accused of destroying the economy of Venezuela. People point out the health service, the help that Cuba gives to other countries in a variety of ways, the education system. How would you assess the success or failure of the Cuban system?
Well, the problem with the Cuban system, and the Cuban leadership admits it, is that their economy is not working. The kind of centrally planned system that they adopted from the Soviet Union led them into a dead end. Raul Castro initiated a program of economic reforms way back in 2011, but they've been very, very slow to adopt it. And I think that's because there's political disagreement within the Cuban leadership about how far to go and how fast to go. So the Cuban government does bear some responsibility for the fact that the economy just hasn't been growing. But you have to understand that within the context of the fact that the United States has had the most extensive, intense embargo against Cuba of any country in the world, and we've been keeping it in place for 66 years.
And what about people's freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom to politically organize, freedom to buy and sell, freedom to travel? What about that?
Well, Cuba is a communist political system. It does not allow the organization of significant opposition political organizations. It does not allow the opposition or the organization of opposition political parties. And in recent years, as the economy has deteriorated, leadership has been increasingly intolerant of any sort of outspoken dissent. And the strategy has been typically to encourage opposition leaders to simply go into exile, get out of the country. And ones who don't are very likely to end up in jail.
Okay. William LeoGrande, a professor of government and specialist in Latin American politics at the American University. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.